We're all here. So these webinars are new to PALAS. We have currently 2 happening this month, including this one, and 2 happening in January. So we hope that at the end of these series that you'll give us lots of feedback for those who are attending. Let us know if it was helpful. Any suggestions for future webinars, please do send them our way. With that, I'm going to share some slides now on just the Leverhulme Trust Early Career Fellowship application and some of the main points that I've kind of taken from the website. So Harry's going to put in, I think, the website link, if you don't have it, of the Leverhulme into the chat. And I'm going to share some slides with you now, just to kind of get us started so we know what we're talking about. So all this information I've taken directly from the website. I haven't changed the wording. That was on purpose so that nobody is mixed up or confused about the eligibility status of these grants and so forth. So firstly, when it comes to the Leverhulme Trust Early Career Fellowship, one of the very important aspects of the eligibility is that you need to actually hold a degree from a UK university, from the higher education institutes, before taking on a fellowship, or that you will say, if you're a PhD student and you've done your degree, you're doing your degree in the UK at the moment, you need to have your Viva Voice completed by the time the application deadline comes around. So that's a really important starting point for the eligibility of this grant. Secondly, you can't have held a full-time permanent academic post in the UK university or comparable UK institute for this particular fellowship. And all candidates must have submitted their doctoral thesis, as I said before, no more than 4 years to the application of the closing date. This is the general rule. However, because of the COVID-19 pandemic, which I'm sure has affected many of you here in attendance today, there is one particular rule that still have been kind of tweaked for that purposes, which is anyone who has formally submitted their doctoral thesis between February 2019 and February 2020 are actually still eligible to apply if their work was impacted by the pandemic. So that's really important to note. That might give some of you an extra year to apply. And the fellow, you need to be resident within the UK for the time of the 3-year fellowship. Another important point, and applicants must be approved and submitted by the Trust no later than the 22nd of February 2024, which is the current application, that will go online, I believe, in January. So it opens to applications in January and closes in February. Those 2 links down below are the most important links to the website and then the grant, the actual management system. So if you want to take a photo of that, please do. Really easy to access though. It's a great website that they have. And lastly, I don't want to bombard you with information, is applicants who have not already moved institutions for the course of their academic career position so far, they should try and nominate a new host university or otherwise demonstrate essentially why you need to stay at the university or the institute that you're already at. So this would maybe apply to people who have particular equipment at that university that's very unique and special and can't be found elsewhere, for example. So as it stands at the moment, the Leverhulme, the way it works is it contributes 50% to your overall salary costs, with the other 50% coming from the host institution, which would be agreed with them beforehand, on maximum there of each year for the award. And that is essentially kind of the basic information that needs to be taken into account. With that, I am by no means the experienced winner of this grant. I've never had this grant before, so that is why we have 3 really great panelists here today that I'm really excited to talk to and listen to their experiences about that. So we have Dr. Jeff Thompson, we have Dr. Anish Naik, I believe is how you say it, and Dr. Thomas Clements here with us today. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what all of you have to say about this grant and your own experiences with it. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. So that was a really, really quick kind of bombardment of like generic information. There is loads of information on the website, more detailed information. If you're looking for it, you can find it there. Let's start. Will we say, Jeff, do you want to start first with your presentation? Is that okay?
Sure thing. Yep.
You can share whenever you want, 5-10 minutes, whatever you need to give presentation.
Be somewhere in between there, and if it's not,
somewhere
just
in between,
just shout at me. I can ramble, though. It's best to not let me do that. Okay, cool. So can my screen be seen if I make this? Oh, or are you seeing the presenter view? Oh, we're good. Okay, brilliant. So Orla did a really great overview of some of the stuff that I'm going to talk about. A lot of things that she mentioned, I think, are actually really important in terms of deciding if the Leverhulme Trust Fellowship is right for you and is worth pursuing. And a lot of those eligibility requirements really, I think, play into whether or not it's something worth going for. So I won this award in 2021. I remember I was submitted this in, I believe, February of 2020. So it was like the last thing. Is that, you want to stop it? Okay, we're good. So it was, I was really glad that I'd applied for it, because sort of went into the lockdown with my other postdoc due to expire at some point, and then I was fortunate to get it. So I wanted to talk about some of the benefits and drawbacks of this, largely speaking from my own experience. So the first one is that I think this is a very paleo-friendly fellowship. So if you're a paleobiologist, the trust has a history of awarding these grants to paleobiologists, which I think is really useful. This is a fossil. There's a fossil Ophiocystioid, which is like a stem group sea cucumber. It was a fossil that I could find. It's a fossil I love. So there's a picture of it. And another benefit is it's for 3 years. So that's a pretty hefty chunk of time in postdoc years. And it really allows you to carry out a fairly substantial either single research project or series of manuscripts that kind of feed around a single thematic topic. So I previous to holding this fellowship, I held a Royal Society Newton International Fellowship, and that was only 2 years. And I could definitely see the difference that it made in terms of how I was approaching the science I was doing. 3 years is, you really don't have to be so worried about applying for the next thing right away when you've got 3 years of sort of stability. And the last thing, not the last thing, another thing that I think has been important for me is I was fortunate enough to secure a lectureship about a year and 5 months into my fellowship. And a nice thing about the Leverhulme Trust Fellowship is it under the right conditions, it is mobile. So on the documentation, it says that you can only move this when there's a real clear evidence of career progression and benefit. And in my case, I got a permanent job, and I went to them and said, hey, I got a permanent job. Can I move it? And they were very happy to do that, which did induce some accounting issues at some point, but that's fine. And the fourth thing, which I think really became useful once I started at Southampton, is that there is a contractual cap on the amount of teaching that you can do under this fellowship, which means that if you arrive at a place that can't load you up with loads of teaching, which can really bulk you down or weigh you down rather when you're trying to build a research career for yourself. So those are some of the benefits I think that have been really nice about this as it has applied to me. And now, what are some of the drawbacks? So
Jeff,
yes,
sorry to interrupt you.
Yes.
It is showing your presenter view.
Oh, it is showing the presenter view. Oh no, so we're all looking. Oh no.
And I was trying to wait for a break.
No, you okay. So you've been seeing one slide ahead of what I should be showing.
Oh,
so
it's like we can still see the right slide, but
you can see the right slide, but
we can see both of them. So
okay.
I don't know if you can.
Oh, that's so weird. Hold on. Sorry. Let me just see if I can do a quick. What if I hide presenter view?
Yeah, maybe that.
Is that better? Or are you just seeing my screen?
Now it's just your regular screen.
Okay. Oh, my regular screen, or a regular or a slideshow version.
No, just like PowerPoint.
Oh, okay. Darn it. This is two screens. You think it's a great idea, and then this happens. What if I move that? Then you're just seeing Zoom.
Perfect. Stop there.
Oh, that's perfect. That's good. Good. Perfect. Okay, great. So sorry about that. Technical mishaps are normal when I'm involved. So that's fine. Yeah, thank you for stopping me and interrupting. So in terms of the drawbacks, and Orla mentioned some of these specifically, but I think they do have sort of implications for actually getting this fellowship. And the first thing is that relative to other fellowships out there, the Leverhulme Trust only pays half of your salary, which means that in terms of identifying a potential host institution, many places will not be keen to take you. So for instance, where I'm at currently at Southampton, they don't have a history of taking on Leverhulme Trust fellows because they don't always have, essentially £70,000 over 3 years or for 3 years sat around to support half of a salary. So I was very fortunate in my, so I first took up my fellowship at the Natural History Museum, and that was only after having applied for NERC independent research fellowships with them unsuccessfully for 2 times over the course of about 3 years. And over that time, I'd had a chance to really develop a nice relationship with people there, and they were very keen to have me. And I was very fortunate in that regard. At the time, I didn't even think this was a big deal. I was like, okay, they're going to support me for another fellowship, as they've done already. That's great. But since actually getting there, they told me, no, we had to go into staff meetings and make the case to the higher administrative staff that it was worth setting aside a chunk of money to support me if I was successful in getting the fellowship. And so that, in terms of identifying an appropriate host institution, I think it's really important to make good relationships, and it could take and really get people who are convinced that they want you, so that they will support you in that half salary contribution. Because from talking to other colleagues, both in paleo and in other fields, many of them have not been able to find support. I know in particular, I see this in the humanities. Places will advertise for the ability to write this fellowship with their support. So they have an internal competition to identify candidates who they want to then apply to the Leverhulme Trust afterwards. So there's that to keep in mind. The second thing is there are some limitations on the spend. You get up to 6,000 per year, which is really great. For most paleo research, that's fine. I do a fair amount of molecular biology and sequencing in my work, and the 6K does become noticeable at that point. And then there are also limitations on how much you can spend per day on the travel, which I realized recently at the GSA meeting when I booked a hotel that was more expensive than that. So you do have to read the fine print. It's not just money that you can spend willy-nilly. And another thing that it can be a drawback is you have to justify your yearly spend. Now, I've never had an instance or been in an instance where or heard of from talking to others, so I'd be curious to hear from the other panelists. I've never been in a scenario where I wasn't given the money I asked for. They've always been quite happy to give me what I asked for. But in terms of internal accounting, this has resulted in some problems recently, where I wasn't aware of how much money I actually had to spend, because the way they give out the money yearly is quite atypical relative to other grants that just give you the lump amount of money at the beginning. And it is a bit faffy having to tell them what you're going to do every year. I mean, it's not that much effort, but it is something that you don't normally do with this fellowship. And the last thing, which Orla talked about in more detail in terms of eligibility, is this isn't a grant that really is designed to support people outside the UK. It's really designed for people based in the UK or with a UK degree at the time of applying. So in my instance, the first time I was applying for fellowships, I was based in the US. This wasn't something I was eligible to apply for. It was only after having come to the UK and done a 2-year postdoc already that I became eligible to apply for this. So because I've gone on about more important stuff, I'll just briefly say what I was doing. So for my grant, I was interested in why different groups of sea urchins had different body plans. So the regular sea urchins, which are a paraphyletic group, and the irregular sea urchins, which are a clade, have really drastic differences in their evolutionary diversification in terms of their body plans. And so that's what I was interested in. So I was exploring this using large-scale CT scanning and morphometrics to quantify morphology and get nice, pretty CT scans of fossils like this. And then we were pairing this with developmental genetics to try and understand some of the molecular mechanisms that underlie the differences in the body plans. So these are some gene expression patterns. So that's what I set out to do. In reality, I've gathered a lot of this data. I've spent the majority of my time doing a slightly related but quite different project from what I told the Leverhulme Trust I was going to do. They haven't seemed to mind that. And there is a flexibility there, which can be quite nice. As long as I've been producing papers, they've seemed to have been quite happy. And as long as it was tangentially related to what I was initially proposed to do, it was quite fine. So advice, when you're writing this fellowship, ask as many people as you possibly can to look over your application, in particular people who aren't paleontologists, because the selection panel that makes the decision, I've gathered from talking to these people at events that the trust puts on, are not specialists in your field. So you want this to be something that's understandable across a wide array of fields. And I think this advice applies to any kind of fellowship. So when you're writing it, tell them what you're going to do in the first sentence of the proposal. This is a stylistic thing. It's worked for me. I did this. This was the first sentence of my fellowship. I told them what I was going to do. I bolded the important parts. I think that's, in general, a good thing to do with fellowships. Make your science exciting. I think we're all capable of doing this because we all love the science we're doing. Hopefully, we're excited about it. So that needs to come through in the proposal. And lastly, get your hands on a successful application if you can as a guide. So I had a friend/colleague who was already successful in getting one of these. So I asked him if I could see his application. That way I knew what a successful application looked like. And I didn't copy it word for word. And obviously the science was very different, but it just showed an example of what worked. So for instance, I always include a figure in proposals. His didn't include a figure, which I found quite weird at the time. So I decided not to include a figure, and it ended up being fine. So just anyway, I'll take the questions later as appropriate because I think I've probably gone too long. But anyway, thanks very much. And I'll stop sharing.
Jeff, thank you so much. That was really, really great. I've made some points that you've brought up there that I'm really interested to ask questions if they don't come up in the Q&A. Just to stick to time, what we'll do is we'll take the other two presentations first, and then we'll move on to all the Q&As. So if anyone has any questions, either write them down now, or you can put them in the Q&A at the moment, and we'll get back to them after the other two presentations. So next up, I mean, it doesn't really matter who wants to speak first. Maybe Anish, if you want to go, and we can have your presentation. I'm really excited because Anish is not a paleontologist, and it's really important, I think, in our community to hear from other people and their perspectives of how this grant and how they've, approached it. So Anish, if you want to start sharing your screen and talk away and give us an overview for your experience.
Sure, yeah. Let me see. So if I do this, is this? Oh, is this? Are you looking at a presentation?
That's perfect. Yeah.
Okay,
Thank you.
Great. Great. So yeah, as Ola said, I'm Anish Naik. I'm a Leverhulme fellow at the Institute for Astronomy at the University of Edinburgh. And so I'm not a paleontologist. I'm an astronomer. This is quite exciting for me because I've actually never met a paleontologist. I've always wanted to. So it's a shame this isn't in person, I guess. Yeah. So I've put some slides together where I'll just talk a little bit. I'll give you a very brief biography, and then, like Jeff did, I'll talk a little bit about my experience of applying for the Leverhulme Fellowship. So I finished my PhD in 2020 at the University of Cambridge, and this was in sort of deep lockdown. And I'd spent many months in this little room writing my thesis, and then after that I took some months off, and then I was briefly a postdoc in the particle theory group at the University of Nottingham, and then after that, starting in January 2023, I began my current fellowship with the Leverhulme Trust. So I applied for the fellowship in this. I applied for the fellowship in February of 2022. And so broadly, my research interests, I'm interested in dark matter, and so maybe some of you don't know what that is, but you've perhaps heard the term bandied about in the media. So dark matter is just a lot of stuff that exists in our universe, and it's completely invisible, and we have no idea what it is. So it's something like 85% of the matter in our universe is what's called dark matter, and we know it's there because it exerts a gravitational influence. It pulls other things via gravity, and so we know it's there, but we just can't see it, and so we don't know what it is. And so my research is using astronomical data to try and work out how the dark matter is distributed within our galaxy and how it behaves, and maybe that will give us some clues about what it is. Yeah, so that's me, and this is where I work at the Royal Observatory in Edinburgh. It's very beautiful. So if any of you are in Edinburgh or visiting Edinburgh, it's a nice walk up to the observatory. Okay, so my Leverhulme fellowship. So when I applied, I proposed 2 projects under this common title of probing fundamental physics in the Milky Way, and it's this sort of 2-pronged research program where project 1 was using a deep learning technique I developed when I was at Nottingham to infer the density of dark matter in the solar neighborhood. And then the second project was using streams of stars observed in the sky to test whether dark matter falls the same as ordinary matter. So this is in some sense equivalent to Galileo's thing of dropping 2 things off the Tower of Pisa and seeing if they fall at the same speed. But now we're doing that with dark matter and visible matter in the 2 hands. And so I proposed Edinburgh because in some sense my research is it sort of sits at an interface between sort of different subfields of astronomy and astrophysics, and I was able to argue that Edinburgh had a lot of experts in these various subfields, and so it would play an ideal host for my research. But I also had personal reasons for applying for Edinburgh, because my partner started a postdoc in Edinburgh the previous year, so we've sort of been quite lucky in being able to at least temporarily solve the 2-body problem. And so my rough timeline was around now-ish, I guess. In the autumn of 2021, I got in touch with the host department at Edinburgh with sort of potential collaborators and sponsors, and also with the university grants team. And then some months later was the application deadline, which I think was at a similar date to the current application deadline in late February. But so it's worth noting that Edinburgh wanted a draft application from me 2 weeks before this, because they then were able to give me some feedback on my proposal, and they also wanted me to make my final submission to Leverhulme 1 week before the official deadline, because the way it works, or at least the way it worked about 2 years ago, was that only after I've made my submission is the host institution able to submit their various things, their costings, etc. And so they wanted a week to do that. So they asked me to make my submission a week before. And so I realized this a little bit late. And so what I had thought was a late February deadline all of a sudden turned into kind of a mid-February deadline, which is a bit scary. So I imagine this perhaps varies from institution to institution, but that's maybe something to look out for. And then I heard back from Leverhulme at the end of May, and so it's also worth noting that at least I found that this whole process is perhaps a little bit later than other fellowship schemes, or at least the other ones I applied for. I applied for maybe 3 other fellowship schemes, and I think in all cases I heard back at least. I think the deadlines were a little bit before Leverhulme, and I also heard back maybe in March or so. And so I wasn't successful with the other fellowships I applied for, and so I kind of made this decision that if I didn't get any of the fellowships, I was going to leave academia and do something else. And so Leverhulme was the only one left, and I was sort of fully prepared to leave academia. I was already thinking about what else I was going to do, and I was making applications and things. But then out of the blue, I got this Leverhulme fellowship at the end of May. And so I've sort of cobbled together some thoughts on this final slide. So I listed some things I was told before. I listed some things I was told before I applied about sort of what makes a good application for the Leverhulme. And I've also listed some things maybe about my application, why I think maybe my application might have been successful. I obviously I don't know truly why my application was successful, but so a few things I was told before my application. One is, so as Jeff said, it's quite a non-technical audience of the selection panel. So I've sort of heard various different things from various people. So some people have said that part of the selection panel at least comprise a subset of the board of Unilever. I don't know if that's true, as well as some academics from various fields. And so I went to a workshop at the University of Nottingham, similar to this one, about applying for the Leverhulme, and the person running for the workshop said that I should write my application for BBC 4 viewers and opera goers. Make of that what you will. I was also told by various people that I think Leverhulme, perhaps as a result of the makeup of the selection panel, they have more of a track record of funding slightly unusual research, so maybe more novel, unusual, high risk projects, and maybe they also have more of a predisposal towards interdisciplinary projects. One really good piece of advice I was given was, if you're a scientist, it's really helpful to show your proposal to an academic in a completely different field, say in the arts or humanities, and vice versa. So this is something I did. I'll go into that a bit later. Another thing I was told was that it's better to structure your proposal just as a single project. I didn't really feel comfortable doing that, because I sort of wanted sort of a multi-pronged research program, as I described earlier. So I just sort of took a bit of a gamble, and I ignored that advice. It seemed to pay off. So yeah. And then why I think my application might have been successful. I think it's a bit of a cliche to say this, but I think first and foremost, it was just a lot of luck. I think I would imagine the vast majority of applications are very good and deserve funding, and I can't truly know why I was picked over any other. Another thing was that I think I was kind of lucky as well with my references, in that, well, I think my referees wrote nice things about me, maybe, but one of my referees in particular was also Leverhulme funded on one of their more senior schemes, and so I think she had a sort of a well-calibrated understanding of what kind of things Leverhulme is looking for, which I think might have helped. Another thing was that the research I was proposing was sort of slightly unusual and perhaps slightly novel, and I really emphasized this in my research proposal, because a non-technical reader wouldn't be able to read a technical description of a project and know a priori that it is novel and unusual if they're not an expert in that field. So it's worth really, really highlighting novel and unusual aspects and driving them home. I also talked a little bit about why I was the right person to do the research. So I sort of cited some of my past publications and listed sort of various analysis tools and skills and things that I'd developed that I would then be able to use in my proposed research. And then finally, I really tried to aim my proposal at a non-technical reader. So this point I made above about showing my proposal to an academic in another field. One of my best friends is an academic musicologist who was applying for Leverhulme at the same time as me, and we both we repeatedly did this exercise of swapping proposals and really honing the proposals until each of us could A, fully understand the other's proposal, and B, be able to read the proposal and understand why the proposed research was important and why it deserved funding. And I think that was a really, really useful exercise for me. So yeah, that's all I wanted to show, and good luck to everyone.
Anish, thank you so much. That was really, really useful and very informative. And I think all of us can appreciate when people share their rejections of grants. Everyone realizes, I mean, this is completely and utterly normal in academia.
Yeah.
I've had 3 grants rejected, of which one of them was a Leverhulme in the last couple of years as well. So it's this really what we're highlighting is your awardees and winners, but the normality is there was a lot of rejections in the background of that as well, and it's good to highlight that, you know, we're aware of that. So again, to the attendees, that we will ask all your burning questions at the end, and we're going to go straight to our last panelist speaker first, Thomas Clements, who if you want to share your screen when you're ready there, Thomas, and we'll do your presentation.
Cool. So yes, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Thomas, and I have already had my Leverhulme fellowship. It has been and gone. So I'm just going to walk you through a little bit about me and whatever. We'll just go through it. Okay, so yeah, my name is Thomas. Some of my key strengths that I think you guys should know about me is that I'm really good at spotting all 151 original Pokemon. I have 12 unblemished years of driving experience, very proficient at video editing. I'm a very good plant dad, and I am in Spotify's 0.01% of Hans Zimmer listeners. Most of that accrued during COVID. My weaknesses is that my knees are messed up. I'm too competitive. I get a lot of anxiety regarding my emails, and my personal obsession with cephalopods are a weakness. It's often used against me, and my weakness is that I am in the top 0.1% of Hans Zimmer listeners on Spotify. But take from that what you will. So what do I do? I'm an experimental taphonomist. So I'm really interested in trying to understand how animals transition from the biosphere into the lithosphere. I mainly work on invertebrates, so cephalopods, polychaetes, insects. I do work on fish, and once I won a talk prize at a vertebrate conference, so I often refer to myself as an award-winning vertebrate paleontologist. And this was used in my Leverhulme. It was very important. So a little bit about me. I just did my bachelor's and then straight into an MSc and then straight into my PhD. I then got a postdoc working for someone else, basically, as part of their ERC grant. And then while I was on that grant, I was applying for independent grants. So I applied for the Leverhulme. I also applied for pretty much everything that was available at the time. And once I finished that, I then became a research fellow where I'm currently at in Germany at FAU. So very quickly, my Leverhulme experience. Why did I apply to Leverhulme? Well, it was, as Jeff sort of pointed out, it was 3 years, which is nice, a little bit longer than some of the other postdocs that were available at the time. The stipend was very generous, I thought, at the time, $6 grand a year, and they're pretty flexible about how you spend it, so long as you do your expenditure in advance. So they would support my fieldwork, but they would also support my experimental work, which not all grant systems do. So that was really important. Again, repeating what Jeff said, there was a lack of teaching. That was really important to me. I'd done a teaching fellowship during my PhD, and teaching, if you don't have experience with it, it really bogs you down and it makes doing research really hard. At the time, the University of Birmingham, and I think they still are, were offering support for applications. My partner was already there, so again, a little bit like Anish, like that for me was a big selling point. And if I'm, I'd be lying if I wasn't saying that one of the other reasons I applied for Leverhulme was because I applied for everything at the time. There wasn't much I hadn't applied for at that point. So I'm just going to go very quickly over this. We've some people have touched on this and we've gone through it. So I just wanted to go through very quickly. So I had an idea about what it is that roughly I wanted to do. I then went and approached host institutions, and Birmingham was the host institution that I approached. Now, not all institutions are accepting Leverhulmes, and there's lots of reasons for this, but most of the time it's because Leverhulme only funds half, which we've already kind of covered about, and often universities don't make money on Leverhulme applications, on Leverhulme postdocs. And so they are very often not willing to fund Leverhulmes. So you basically need to be really careful with where you're applying and not wasting too much time. So you need to be careful on that front. Then, as we've had, there's an internal round. At Birmingham, we had 2 internal rounds, one to get through to the internal round. So it was like an internal round inception. And this was months and months in advance. So I had to have not a complete, but a fairly formed application months and months and months before the actual Leverhulme deadline. And this can often catch people out, I think. And you are not necessarily guaranteed to make it through internal rounds. I was very fortunate that I did. And then obviously you have your final application. Then once you go through the internal rounds and they greenlight you, then you submit it to the Leverhulme, and then the Leverhulme make their decisions. And they often, as we've had, there is a lot of luck involved. And I did a quick Google. In 2018, it was an 18% success rate. So, and we know that since COVID, there are a lot more applications. So just bear that in mind. A lot of it is luck. So the title of my work was Tackling Taphonomic Biases of Mass Extinction, Aftermath and Recovery. Basically, to cut a very long story short, the Permo-Triassic mass extinction was the most devastating. And I wanted to have a look at ray-finned fish in particular, because basically they survived the mass extinction and they're often thought of as disaster taxa, but no one had really looked at them. And there really hadn't been much work on them done at all. And so one thing that's really interesting about these fossils is that they're found all over the world, and they even have a name for their fauna. That's how many of them there are. But again, no one had really studied them. And what I thought was maybe if we could look at global taphonomic signals, we could understand more about fossilization biases occurring at this time and understand if the impact of the Permo-Triassic mass extinction was biased by taphonomy. And so that was basically my entire project summed up in 4 to 5 sentences. I tried to make an interdisciplinary project. People have talked about that already. I tried to, obviously, paleo, taphonomy, sampling biases, and geochemistry, and I tried to sandwich them all together. And I tried to showcase to the Leverhulme that I could do all of those things. Obviously, novelty is really important, and they care a lot about novelty, but I made sure in my application to really explain to them why this was important and why we should do it now, and what implications it had for paleontology in general, as well as for the wider world. And I kind of, I used the current mass extinction that is happening at the time to sort of sell that story. Maybe cheaply, some people would argue, but that was what I did at the time. I think one thing that I got constantly in workshops was to showcase how your skills and your publications that you already have allow you to solve those problems and how they allow you to do that. And I really showcase that. And I think it's really funny that we've had people talking about showing their applications to other people. So I was told in multiple workshops, try to avoid technical jargon because some of the reviewers will not be scientists. So I made sure that it was over Christmas and I made my mum read it. I also used lots of workshops that Birmingham provided at the time to sort of try to hone the application. So these are not important, you don't have to read these, but some of the key things that came up a lot in workshops was have objectives that are achievable. So I came up with 3 distinct objectives that I was going to aim for. And then I made sure that I had very distinct timelines of when those objectives would be achieved. So I would aim to finish them year 1, year 2, year 3. And I think the Leverhulme, from all of the applications I saw in advance that were paleo, and from all of the workshops, they really love timelines because they want to know that you can feasibly do this in 3 years. So the project the project implementation for me was basically hampered by COVID. It was awful. It was an absolute nightmare. I started the Leverhulme about 5 to 6 months before COVID hit. So I had just finished all of the planning. I had just finished booking, traveling to places, and then lockdown happened. I couldn't do any lab work. I couldn't do any field work, and I couldn't do any museum visits. And basically my project just stopped. The unfortunate thing was I got absolutely zero support from my host institution. They refused to furlough me. I lost 18 months of research time. They offered very little pastoral support. And at the end of COVID, they refused any extensions or any support, despite the Leverhulme offering that support. Leverhulme were generally supportive, but they were very limited in the actions that they could provide. And they seemed either unable or unwilling to pressure the university to actually do something, despite them saying, like, you know, Thomas should be furloughed and he should get an extension at the end. So it was quite difficult, if I'm brutally honest. And the net result was that I lost a lot of research time, and I effectively, from a 3-year postdoc, have had 0 outputs that directly pertain to the project. It also caused a lot of mental health issues. But one of the great things was that Leverhulme were really supportive, and they let me keep my stipend afterwards to continue my research sort of in my own time, if that made sense. So Leverhulme were really good in that regard. And this all made me a very sadvocado. But was the Leverhulme the right funding for me? Yes, the stipend was very generous, but really importantly, they pay the stipend to you. That's really important, and many of you might not realize this, but if you get it paid to the universities, your host institution, they will take a cut, or they can take a cut. Not always, but most of the time they will take an overhead. If they pay it if Leverhulme pays it directly to you, you don't lose any money. So that's really awesome. The cap on teaching was awesome. The application is fairly short. It's 2 pages of application and then lots of little boxes. The admin that you have to do for the Leverhulme is actually really small. The yearly report, they require yearly reports, but they're very simple. Generally speaking, the Leverhulme had amazing communication during COVID. Whenever I needed something or I emailed them or I wanted support, they were pretty much always there. And they have someone who is sort of in charge of all of the early career fellows, so you can ping them questions whenever you need them. And they were very flexible once the grant was awarded. Once I told them, look, I can't go into the lab, I can't do this, I want to write a paper on paleontology in video games, they were like, great, you go away and do that. So they were really awesome, and we actually managed to publish with that. And then the only thing they said to me at the end was, just make sure that you put the Leverhulme at the bottom on the papers. So that was awesome. The weaknesses for the Leverhulme for me personally was that you are employed by the host university, which means that they control everything. They control your pay, your medical leave, parental leave, and Leverhulme can really offer very limited support in that regard. And that's something which I just wasn't aware of at the beginning, even when I started my Leverhulme. And that left me, obviously COVID is fingers crossed, as a circumstance that won't ever happen again in the near future, but it just goes to show that if something happens, you are at the university's whim, not at Leverhulme's whim. What I found out as well, which I didn't really realize, is that when I applied to Leverhulme and I got it, it made me ineligible for other fellowships. So that's something you need to be careful of, be wary of if you haven't read about that. And then one thing I would say is that make sure your salary is valued fairly. Because when I started, the host institution put me on a band, and then it turned out that that band was incredibly low. And when I contacted the Leverhulme, they were very surprised that I was on such a low band. And it basically took a lot of arguing back and forth to get put on the correct band, because again, everything goes through your host institution. So just make sure that you value yourself properly when you're putting in your application, and make sure you put in like an appropriate salary for your career stage. And that's it. That's all I have. And I'm happy to take any questions.
That was great. Thank you so much, Thomas. I think that was really, really useful to hear both the positives and the negative experiences that you had during COVID. And I would hope that for anyone here that we don't have to go through another pandemic again. But I think it's really important that we are aware that when these like much larger out of control things happen, that we need to think, are we in the right host institution? Is this grant going to support me for these larger out of control problems? So I'm really happy you highlighted that. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Anish, you had your hand raised there.
Sorry, yeah, it was just a quick point on one of the things Thomas said, which has since changed, which is that they no longer pay the stipend directly to the grant holder. I think that changed the cohort before mine or something.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't know that. Now, sad times.
Yeah.
Okay, so now it goes to the host institution. Is that correct?
Mine has gone to the host institution, yeah.
Okay. So they've changed that. So slightly less control than overall, I gather, with how you access your own funding.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Good to know. Thank you. So thank you again to the three of you for the presentations. It's really useful. It's a good way to kind of get started on the questions. people know what experiences you've had so far and how you found the overall applying to the grant as well. So that's been really useful. Harriet, do you want to sort of set off the questions there? I'm just having a look through them here now.
Yep, we can just start from the top. There are a couple of more, what's the word, logistical questions. So Suraj asked, is a person without any degree from the UK eligible for the fellowship? I think, Jeff, you just had the postdoc, right?
Correct. Yeah, I don't have a degree from the UK.
So it doesn't have to be a degree from the UK.
It doesn't have to be, yeah. You have to be one or the other is my reading of it.
So it's like an academic qualification or job in the UK.
I think you don't even, I'm not, yeah, I don't.
It's a bit funny, the wording on the website, because I would have thought it meant only an academic degree, but I thought it was interesting when you said that you had your 2-year postdoc that they accept that. So
yeah,
I'm really happy you highlighted that.
It's the degree. My reading is the degree or the like essentially residency with a job. I was at UCL for 2 years, so that made me eligible. Apparently, maybe I was never eligible. Who knows? But it worked out in the end.
So I guess that might indeed, if it is that complicated, that might also be if you have a specific situation, it might be best contacting Leverhulme directly to get their advice on that, because if indeed it's slightly contradictory to their wording in Jeff's case, then maybe it's worth getting in touch with them. And so Lorenzo asked whether they changed this eligibility recently, because he thought previously it wasn't mandatory to have academic experience in the UK. I guess it now does explicitly say. Whether that said that in the past, I don't know.
Currently, what I've taken from the website was in the last week. So as far as I understand it, as Jeff pointed out, it's either like an academic qualification or it's a higher level degree. And as far as I'm aware, it's been like this for a number of years. I would have applied to the Leverhulme in 2017. And at the time, it existed then anyway, that you needed a higher level degree. So as far as I can tell from what they've written on their website, you do. But I would also encourage to contact Leverhulme. They're actually quite easy and very useful to email, and they get back to you relatively quickly about those kind of general questions. But I think the overall assumption is that you need a qualification or some degree. Yeah.
And then the last logistical one before we talk about maybe the application process and difficulties and things was Nydia wanted to ask Jeff if there was any issues related to immigration status with the UK. So I know you've just got your permanent leave, which is good.
Yeah, so there was at the time, so I was already in the UK. So I came in 2019 on a Royal Society fellowship, and that as part of that, I paid for 5 years of the health surcharge. So I had a visa for 5 years. And so when I applied for the Leverhulme, it still would have expired. My fellowship would have expired still before my visa expired. So I didn't have any issues at that point in time. I've since got indefinite leave to remain, and so it's fine. But so I didn't have any issues with that. But that might be something you would need to talk to a host institution about as well. Because they would potentially need to. Again, I didn't interact with the NHM about immigration stuff because I already had it all set for the interval, but that might be something you would need to talk to a host institution about, because they, I imagine, would have to support you for some sort of a visa.
Thank you. So moving on, I think slightly less logistical, but there's a good number of questions about applying and such. What are your thoughts on whether Leverhulme prefer interdisciplinary proposals rather than single field proposals, to whoever feels able?
Mine was very interdisciplinary. Based on what we've seen today, it seems like all three were quite interdisciplinary. So I don't know if it has to be, but mine very much was.
I think it's pretty, I don't have experience necessarily in the UK system, but I think increasingly internationally, it's the case that you're going to stand a better chance with an interdisciplinary project, and demonstrating that in terms of collaborations, research you do already, planned collaborations and research. Even, I think, so I'm here in Switzerland, so it's a slightly different system, but I had a recent discussion about this for a Swiss grant. And they did make the point that one thing that's nice to consider is that they often refer to this type of thing in Switzerland as mobility rather than like interdisciplinary suchness. And they said it's worth considering your interdisciplinary in other areas as well, and how that relates to your project. So not necessarily saying, oh, well, I'm working with a sedimentologist on this type of thing, because for me that's interdisciplinary, but maybe co-opting methods from that are traditionally used in another field, that's totally interdisciplinary. So like think about not just people or like big areas, but methods or like data sources or data types or that type of thing. So it's not necessarily like has to be, you know, big top level multidisciplinary stuff, but I imagine everyone would say it's pretty common these days that they do kind of want that in an application.
Yeah, and I think Leverhulme do like that, don't they? Thomas,
Yeah.
sorry, you're going to say something there.
No, I mean, I think one thing that we should say, like just caveat everything, is that we're not actually really sure what the Leverhulme look for, as are we not sure with a lot of these grant things. And the grant panels change every year. And, you know, I think Anish pointed out, like, you know, that his references provided him really nice references. Like, we don't know the weighting of the reference to the application. Like, there's a lot of gray. But I think from I went to quite a lot of workshops, and it was repeated that interdisciplinary, generally speaking, seems to be favored, and that it should be your ability to transcend those interdisciplinary sort of sections, not your ability to have collaborators who work in those other fields. They want to know how you can do the job and what aspects you can pull across. And I think in my personal application, I can't speak for everyone here, but in my personal application, you know, I said, you know, I can do this and I can do that and I can do this from these different fields and I can bring them together. But I'm not an expert in this field, which is why I'm going to Birmingham, because they at Birmingham are specialists in this field. So they will help me with that and train me with that. So it showed not only could I do those things, but I would develop personally in this other way. And who knows if that helped, but I got funded, so.
Thank you, Thomas. I'm just looking at the chat here for some questions. I don't know if you had an order, Harriet, but there's one here that's just popped up for me from Penelope, who said, thank you to the panelists. And the question to everyone was, what is the hardest part of the application? Really good question. For example, internal application to the host university. Somebody who would like to, Anish, maybe do you want to chime in on that?
Yeah, so I was lucky in that I didn't have these internal rounds that it sounds like other people have had. I think my institute, they have them some years and then other years they don't. It depends on that level of interest. But so I didn't have that. But I would say maybe coming up with the idea and framing it is the hardest part. I think yeah. I mean, writing a proposal is very difficult, obviously, but I think the initial stage of coming up with the idea is the hardest part.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that. Jeff, what do you think would be the hardest part for you?
Yeah, that I think with any grant, for me, is it good enough? Like, you have to not only have a good idea, but I think you've really got to believe in it. And I mean, this is separate. I put in 5 grant proposals the last year. One of them was funded. Of the 5, the one that was funded was the only one that I was really like, yeah, I feel like this could get funded. The others, it was sort of like, well, I'm putting this in because it's been made very clear I need to do this. But the idea isn't maybe 100%, and they weren't funded. So I think it's coming up with a good idea that, and I think to some extent you can recognize it. If you're not 100% sure on it, it's probably not worth pursuing. And that can come with time. Like you work on these, right? So I'm developing an idea right now, and over the last 3 weeks, maybe every week, it's gotten a little bit closer, and I feel like it'll get there, but it's not there yet. So
I was saying coming up with the idea itself can almost take longer than the actual entire application process. If you don't have, as Anish had, like no sort of host institution deadlines, that the idea itself, I mean, it can be there in the back of your mind for a year or two, and you can be thinking about it and rehashing it before you actually apply, right? So having a ton of ideas is really, really important, and then using them and developing them over time. Thomas, is there anything different you think was harder than the idea itself, or something equally as important?
The idea one is interesting. I was the complete opposite. Like I literally was at a conference, slightly too intoxicated, if I'm brutally honest, and I wrote the idea on the back of a napkin, literally at a Chinese restaurant, and then the next day fleshed out the idea. So I think it's very different. For me, my difficulty was trying to articulate concisely why this was super important and why it needed to be done. And I think a lot of people can come up with ideas, and I think a lot of people can write applications, but a lot of in the workshop that we had other people who submitted like pre-proposals. One of the things in the workshops that we were asked to do was present our proposals as pre-proposals, and many of them had really good ideas, but they just didn't have any like, why are you doing this? Like, who cares? Like, who is this going to impact? Why should the Leverhulme because I think someone said like Leverhulme tend to like high risk stuff, and I think that is true. I've heard that so many times. And by high risk, we don't mean that you won't be able to achieve it in 3 years. They mean as in like there is a chance that your data will get like no results. That's okay. But they need to know, like, who cares about this question? Like, who is going to actually be reading your papers at the end of it? And are you going to be influencing the field? And I think that's what they're kind of looking for. And my big concern after my idea was, is my idea enough? And I was racked with self-doubt for a long time. Is this idea enough? Like, is this good enough? And so, yeah, I think just stick with it. It's also much luck.
No, that's a really good answer. Thank you. Harry, do you want to pick out another question that we have there?
Yeah, so there's
I don't know if I've lost your trail of questions.
No, right. So there's a couple of questions to do with the like host institution stage, applying to be with the institutions themselves. So one's from Lisa and from Connor. So first off, I think a pretty easy one for universities that have internal rounds. If you're successful, do they provide additional feedback and support with your application? I imagine that's very institution dependent on the level of support. I think someone mentioned they had a lot of support. Anish?
Yeah, I think, as you say, it varies from institution, but I think most people I've heard about at various institutions have had institutional support in the sense of there'll be people at the host institution who read your proposal and give you feedback on it. Yeah, I think that's pretty common.
Yeah, but it is the type of thing you could ask an institution you're considering applying for, although it sounds like they're slightly more sparse with Leverhulme, as people talked about, so maybe that is a difficult thing to choose. But
I think just to jump on this, and it might have changed because I am a Leverhulme or OAP, so I don't really know. But at Birmingham, they only would submit a certain amount of applications from each discipline. So like earth sciences got a set number, biology got a set number, physics got a set number, and they would only put in a set number. So the feedback was pretty brutal the first time round, but very constructive. But just like, it feels bad when your application gets ripped to shreds. But it was really useful. And it was really good as well to have lots of people in your field say, hey, look, maybe this section doesn't read well, or I don't understand this section. Could you clarify it? So yeah, I got lots of good feedback. But what I was trying to say at the beginning with the limited numbers is that sometimes if you go through the first internal round, they might say to you there will be no feedback with the first internal round because they just have too many. So that's something I just asked in advance. I said, will I get feedback on this? And they were pretty honest with me.
Jeff, do you have anything to add there?
So I didn't have internal rounds that I went.
Oh, sorry, you didn't.
Yeah,
okay.
but
Yeah.
I mean, I asked. I think I probably had 2 people at the museum look at it when I was applying there and provide feedback. But then I mostly asked just other people, like people at my mentor when I was at UCL. I asked my mentor to look at it. His feedback was very useful. He'd been funded by the Leverhulme Trust before, so I felt like what he had to say was like, oh, take that on board for sure. And then even just colleagues, other postdocs, as many who were very much not paleontologists. So it was, again, like, it's just a broad amount of people. But I guess in retrospect, the NHM didn't, the people I was going to work closely with read it over and said, yeah, tweak that, why is this important? But it wasn't a huge amount of internal feedback.
I think Jeff raises a good point as well, though. If that is the situation where you don't necessarily have the institutional support, I certainly find, and I think it seems like it's everyone else's experience as well, that most people are going to be happy to give you feedback on an application like this. So really just like reach out and directly ask people, even if it's, individual academics from the potential host institution or not. I think most people are really happy to give you feedback. So it's always worth kind of casting the net wide and asking. So to follow that up, related to the same thing, it's a bit more of a logistical question. Connor wants to know what, in your experiences, the typical time taken to complete the host institution stage was. And I know Anish gave us some really detailed information on this. And Connor wants to know whether it is kind of too late seeking out a host institution for the current round of applications.
So for me, because I didn't have any internal rounds, now was around the time I was reaching out to, now is around the time I reached out to Edinburgh. I think it was the case that they said that if they were to have an internal round, their deadline would have been in mid-December sometime. So there's still some time there, but I think, yeah, maybe Thomas has a better idea of when these internal round deadlines typically are.
Yeah, they were quite early for me. And obviously, again, it differs from institution to institution. But I think one of the best things to do, what I did, was just when I contacted, so for full clarity, Birmingham wasn't the only institution that I contacted. And I just asked them, when is your normal application system? And I think Birmingham sort of said, the first round will be sometime in November, but it was fairly rapid. At the time when I was emailing, I remember it was literally 2 or 3 weeks. But yeah, just try. And the other thing as well is that, if you ask them, nowhere really publishes it. It's quite hard to find online the information. So you really have to reach out to people. But normally they have, most large UK universities will have offices specifically for grant funding and for funding writing, and you can find them on their web pages, and you can then contact them and ask them what the deadlines are in advance, which is kind of what I did.
I think that's a really key point. Don't only reach out to academics, also reach out to the grants teams and the sort of the appointed people at these universities who handle fellowship applications. I think they'll often have a much better, they'll be much more organized than the academics and have a much better idea of how to deal with you, I think.
Much better at deadlines.
Yeah.
But I should also note as well, at Birmingham, because it's such a large institution, there were different internal deadlines for each department. So if you were going to, I mean, I don't know if you're allowed to do this internally, but if you were to hedge your bets and put one in with earth science and one in with biological sciences, they might have conflicting deadlines. So that's also important to know. And I think that's why the grant teams generally are good people to contact, because they know what's overarching happening within the university.
Exactly. I think Lisa wrote in UOB, which I guess is the University of Birmingham, deadline is the 10th of November. Thank you, Lisa, for putting that into the chat there. Let's see if we have another question here. Is it the top one here? Rachel asked in terms of what grants are available for people returning to academia following a long career break, i.e. PhD longer than 10 years ago. It's a very good question. That's something that I need to look into and figure out. Do any of our panelists, are they aware of how, I think with this particular grant that we're discussing today, I think it's it's no more generally than 4 years after, but I think if you've taken a career break, they can take that into consideration. Is anyone aware of how that works?
I'm not really sure. I'm not sure whether the early career fellowship has a limited time since your PhD that's elapsed. I think that's the case. But I mean, I can't answer because I'm not an applicant, but I do know through my role in societies and stuff that there are grants available. The Leverhulme doesn't have a grant, which is for returning researchers, as far as I'm aware. But I think like the Wellcome Trust have one, and I think that UKRI have a list on their website to look for, which can explain grants for returning people who want to return to academia. But the other thing that I will say, and I know this, is that a lot of universities have independent internal grants. So sometimes it's worth, if there's an institution that you want to go to or someone that you want to work with, just contact them and ask them if the institutions have them. Because some of the large universities do have them set up to help, especially if you were an alumni. That also really helps. So those are things to look for that I would advise.
Another one I think that people often go for after career breaks is the Dorothy Hodgkin Fellowship from the Royal Society. Which I think historically was specifically for people returning from a career break, but I think as of I think I heard as of a couple of years ago, it's no longer just specifically for that, but it's still kind of perhaps geared towards people returning from a career break, or very friendly towards people returning from a career break. Yeah.
That's actually a really good point. I forgot about that one, and I've just taken a note of it there. So for hopefully future webinars, we can maybe do like a panel discussion on something like that as well. So we can have better discussions about those other grants that are available for people returning to academia. We have another question here from Bethany. How many papers did you say or imply you would write in your proposal? Jeff, do you want to start off this one?
I think I probably said 3. I think I said 1 per year. And then I said I was going to submit them to like Nature and stuff like this, you know, which I didn't. But you have to pitch it. Yeah, I guess I probably said, I either said I was going to do 3 or I was going to do 3 and then have like a mega paper at the end that combined it all. Suffice to say, papers have come out. Whether or not it was those 3, well, it wasn't, but that's okay.
Exactly. I think it's a good point. You kind of have to aim high and then tell them these certain things, but we all know that where we publish is not always up to us, depending on the research and the outcomes anyway of what you've done. So that's a very good point. Thomas, what did you write in your proposal?
So I couldn't remember because it was too long ago. So I just pulled my proposal up, and I was very vague. I can read to you what I wrote. I said that the results of my investigation will be disseminated at national and international conferences and in a series of publications aimed at high impact journals. So I was super vague. I basically promised nothing, knowing that nothing would happen due to COVID. That's a joke.
I said, I think almost exactly what Thomas said. I was very, very vague. I said this proposed research will result in a series of publications in high impact peer review journals. I think those are my words. So almost word for word. So yeah, I guess I don't really know what people feel about whether it's a good idea to be vague or not, but I guess it seems either strategy might work.
One thing I will say, just adding on to this, is that I did add a very small section on impact, just in generally, which was part of the end of my application had a section on impact and dissemination. And I also talked about engagement and outreach and how I would tie into, at Birmingham, we had a museum, how I would tie my application into what they do and how that would outreach and engagement. And I got loads of positive feedback on that from at the workshops. Obviously, I don't have no idea whether or not Leverhulme thought it was a good idea. But I don't think a lot of people necessarily think about that or add that to their applications. But if you can, then I would highly recommend doing something similar.
That's a really good point, Thomas. It's something that comes up more and more often now. You see this highlighted by funding bodies to highlight, what will be the outcomes in terms of outreach and what your plans are for that. Jeff or Anish, do you have any kind of input with that? Is that something you also added to your applications or thought about?
I was just looking and I did not, but it's a good idea. I mean, I think that's more and more becoming the way with any grant application, is that you need to discuss the impact. It's becoming a bigger part of research life in the UK, certainly. So I think it's only a good idea.
Yeah, I sort of did this, but I think in less of a concrete way than Thomas. I think my closing paragraph, I think I had a few sentences, including this one about this period, the high impact publications. I had a few sentences where I said what would be the outcomes of my research. So, presentations at conferences, publications, new collaborations with such and such, and that kind of thing.
Yeah, that is how I ended mine, with an outcomes section as well, with the papers and the presentations.
Okay, yeah. So there's a mixture there, but definitely overall there's a leading towards this becoming a more important aspect of an application, as being aware of how we use these grants to not only inform the scientists but also the public in more general about the research that we do. So it's something to bear in mind. Harry, is there any other questions there in the chat?
I think that's it from my question point.
Okay, that's great. There's actually one question that I had for all of you, just out of pure interest. How many drafts do you think you wrote for your application? And would you have said that your overall, would it have gone to more than, say, 5-6 people that read it? And how important do you think it is that you're going through these different drafts and getting that input? How important do you think that is overall just for people to be aware that the first draft they make is absolutely not going to be the last? I think it's important to show the amount of drafts that we're doing. I think for mine, there was, I don't know, a close to 10, I think, by the time the draft was perfect and ready to go.
That number sounds about right to me, about 10. I'd also submitted a very similar project to NERC for a NERC IRF that was not funded. And I probably went through an equal number of drafts with that. So really, I think the benefit is if you can take one project and apply for that project across multiple funding schemes, that's a great idea, because you end up trimming off the fat throughout that process. So yeah, many drafts.
Thomas, what about you?
Well, I am a stickler for my file labeling system. So I know that I have at least 14 drafts, because I have, so if I send it to someone, then I get a new number, but I also have like 0.2, 0.3, 0.4 if they're giving me back edits. So my final one was like 14.2, I think. So I would guesstimate probably around 20 versions. But I did go through 2 internal rounds, and they gave me a lot of feedback the first time. So that was a big, I wouldn't say a rewrite. It wasn't a rewrite, but there was substantial edits made and restructuring at that point. Yeah.
I think for me it was fewer draft, if only because this was, I think, one of the last fellowship schemes I applied to, so I had a lot of sort of polished material from earlier applications I could recycle. And also I think I think I find it stressful a little bit getting feedback sequentially. I prefer to send a thing out to a bunch of people, get everyone's feedback, and then do it all at once. I think that works better for me. So.
Okay, great. Thank you. I'm just going to check the chat one more time before we wrap it up. I don't think we have any other questions coming in. If there isn't any in the next couple of minutes, I just thought that kind of to round things up, if there was sort of one main piece of advice that each of you would like to share and say, okay, this was absolutely, like, for me, something that really helped me with my overall application process, what would it be in terms of, was it reaching out to the host institution to begin with? Was it reaching out to people to read the application? What was kind of the one major theme that you felt like you learned from this process, and that you would want to know as you're you know, going back to your past self, what you would tell them now? Thomas, I'll let you go first. I'm just picking names out of a hat.
Well, that's a really hard question. I mean, there are so many different aspects of the application which I found very stressful and difficult. One thing that I learned on this application, which I've used on subsequent applications, is when I wrote my Leverhulme, I was really self-conscious of my publication record. At the time, I had a very small amount of papers, like maybe 3. I had more in the works and more in review, like 2 were stuck in review. And I was really self-conscious that they're going to just read my application and they're going to look at my publication history, because they ask you to submit that as part of your CV, and they're just going to write me off. And so I wrote in the application, you know, where it was relevant, I wrote my papers, I referenced my papers that were in prep. And that was a really big deal for me, because it actually fleshed out a lot of, like, how I fit into this research. You know, I told them where the papers were going, where they'd been submitted, or when I was going to submit them, but I used in prep. And I didn't really know that was a thing before this. And so if you're worried about your publication record, if you're you know, fresh out of your PhD and you only have a handful of papers, then, you know, so long as you're transparent and honest, I think that you can say, look, I have a paper, I've nearly finished writing it, and this is where it fits into this body of work. So I would recommend going down that route.
That's a really good piece of advice, and I think it's important to know. I mean, this is why it's called an early career research fellowship. So people, I don't think, need to be fearful of their publications when they're approaching this. And with this kind of writing, it also makes you a better writer for writing those papers. I think so. Getting that really harsh feedback from friends and family and colleagues on these sort of things. So, Anish, do you have a piece of advice you would give your past self?
Yeah, I thought. Well, I think the most. I mentioned this in my slides. I think the most useful thing I did when I was writing my proposal was this exercise of showing my proposal to an academic in a sort of a diametrically opposed discipline. So I mentioned I was showing it to this academic musicologist friend of mine, and he's this sort of the type of humanities scholar who very, very proudly knows nothing about science, and so it was I think it was. And you know, there are a lot of ways in which a scientist can write about science where you take a lot of things for granted, which actually you shouldn't take for granted. Like I might have written about written about testing whether dark matter falls the same as other stuff, and my friend would say, what does it mean for things in space to fall, and things like that, and like just, you know. Bits of your writing are highlighted that you wouldn't have noticed otherwise, I think. And another thing also, which I sort of forgot to mention earlier, but Thomas reminded me of, is it can be it's really, really good to read examples of successful proposals in the past, because I think you'll, when you write your proposal, you might send it off and get a lot of feedback from different people. All of that feedback might contradict itself, and it can be very difficult to know what to do. And I think it helps if you already have a very well calibrated sense of what a successful proposal looks like, which can only come through reading successful proposals.
That's a really good piece of advice, actually, and something that I would also really encourage is the looking and seeing successful applicants' work really helps you focus on where the parts aren't working for you in your own applications. So it's a really good point. Jeff, what would be the one piece of advice you want to leave here with to tell everybody?
I guess it's not specific to the Leverhulme Trust app, but it's just that, like, rejection is the norm and this takes time, and it's worth writing. If you've got a project that you're diehard about, try it out a few different places. Like so for the fellowship I had before the Leverhulme Trust, the Royal Society one, I think that app went in May for whatever reason, but I'd been writing proposals on the same project since September, all of which had gotten rejected, but I'd been able to get the feedback, which was very useful. And so I was able to use that feedback and think, oh, well, people clearly think this bit's bad, so I'll chuck it or I'll tweak it or whatever. And then I mean, obviously, as Thomas mentioned, there's a massive amount of luck in all of this, which you can't be undervalued. Like, there's a stochastic element to getting funding, but I think if try multiple times and expect to be rejected. I've talked to, in my current role, I've talked to some colleagues that I really respect who have gotten, had pretty much consistent funding throughout their career. And they say that, they pretty much are coming in at a 20% success rate. 1 in 5 is still a really great number. So expect the rejection, and you have to be resilient and try a lot.
Again, another very important piece of advice that I would completely agree with. I think that, you can kind of get worn down with the amount of rejections, but I think all the 3 of you guys kind of show hope that, there was plenty of rejections behind the success, which is not the part that you see, but it is the majority of the iceberg of grant application is the rejections that are underneath. And I cannot stress that enough to everybody else that's here today. So thank you again so much to all 3 of you for being here and being very honest and open about your experiences. I think I've learned a lot. I'm sure that everyone else here has learned a lot. With that, and when we're wrapping up, I will say to the attendees that I'm going to send around a survey so I can get some feedback on the webinar and your own experiences. So I'm sorry, you will get one more email from me before the time is out. So you can expect that probably in the next week. We'll have a survey, and I'm just going to quickly share my screen again just to show you the next webinar again, just to remind you guys when that's happening. So we have here, hopefully you can see that. So the next webinar that Pannellists is doing is on the 22nd of November, so only a couple of weeks till that, and that is going to be on the 1851 Royal Commission Research Fellowship. So we are really excited. We have our 3 panelists lined up now, which should be just as informative and useful, I hope, as this one. And as I said, we have one on the Newton International Fellowship, which might be important for a lot more kind of broader people coming to the UK. And in January, again, we have the NERC, the ERC starting grant. So hopefully that will be useful to some of you here. Please spread the word. These are open and free webinar events to anybody in any field, really. So I encourage you to kind of share this information with other people, because although we're mostly paleontologists here, this absolutely, as you can see with the niche here as well, it's the same experiences and similar success stories on how they applied. So if you have other friends or colleagues that need this information, please do let them know. It's not just a paleontological event. With that, though, the Paleontological Association has provided this. So for the paleontologists that are here, I do encourage you to become a member of PALAS. It's really, really important. There is lots of really nice things on the website to look at. We have obviously more of these webinars coming down the line, and you can find all kinds of information about the Paleontological Association on our website. So I encourage you to go there and have a look at that. So with that, I want to thank all of you, my co-host Harry as well. Thank you for being here. And also just to quickly highlight that I'm aware that there is a gender imbalance on the panel this week. The next panel discussion, there will be a better gender balance. So I'm sorry, I apologize for that this week, and I am aware of it. And the next one will be better. So we will improve. With that, I'd like to have a great evening, guys, and I hope it was really useful. So thank you very much. Take care, everybody.